Mr. Esmond's doing great. Thank you for asking. Okay, so I think everyone here has suffered under my teaching a little bit. Was anybody here in spring of 16 when I subbed for Mr. Esmond for 8 weeks in a row?
No, 16, no.
Yeah, so that was almost 2 years ago. Yeah, so 2 or 3 of you. Okay. So I know I subbed a little bit of lab, and I think I did a lecture or two this semester. So who doesn't have my cell phone number? Okay. You didn't write it down the last time I was here? Okay. Well, I'm not them. You're not used to it. That's all right. Pardon me? What about my microphone? Mr. Esmond said I'm going to give you 2 tests, so I'm going to give you 2 tests. There's 5 weeks left if you don't count finals week. The last day of regular classes is Friday, December 8th. And then the week after that, starting on December 11th, the 11th through the 16th, I think somebody told me it was Friday, but I'm not sure. In any case, I'm going to be here for 5 weeks through the last day of class. So we're going to have the first test about 2.5 weeks in. And I will warn you, let's put it this way. Probably it'll go like this. Not this Friday, but next Friday we'll be finishing 2 weeks. And that Friday, before we leave, I'm going to say the test is going to be on Wednesday or something like that. We'll cover everything from today all the way through the day before the test. And it'll be a big test. It'll probably take you most of the time to do it because I like big, fat tests. And not because I want students to do badly, but I want to check lots and lots of information to see if you picked it up, whether you got it inside of your brain. And then the last test, I'm going to coordinate, second test, I'm going to coordinate with Mr. Ritchie and Mr. Zilke. And if they're going to give their tests on that last Friday of class, December 8th, I'm going to do the last test, not the final, but the last test in here, probably that Thursday. And then I was thinking of bringing in my disco ball, and we're just going to have a dance party that Friday, the 8th. And it'll be judged, the dancing. And that'll be 1 day of lecture grade. We'll have your quiz score will be a demonstration of disco skills. All right, what's going to be on the test? Mr. Esmond has given me the tests that he has used in the past. I'm going to be looking at them, and I'm going to be editing them because I'm the one doing the lecture. But he said that, like I said, I haven't looked at it. He likes to take FAA questions. He likes to edit the questions. And then he always likes to add at least a 4th answer. So you can expect a lot of that. You can also expect on these 2 tests, I'm going to write questions and that are not an FAA test question. I like the FAA. They're a wonderful organization, except when they're not. And one of the things they're not wonderful about is accurately asking written questions of aircraft mechanics students of everything you need to know. So if they're stuck in class that the FAA doesn't ask about, I'm going to be asking questions about it. So that really leads into, we'll come back to that one, is to note-taking techniques or note-taking methods. Interestingly enough, and I don't have any heartburn if you want to come up and take a picture, but I'm actually recording the lecture. It'll be on YouTube this evening, so that if you miss anything, like you're absent or you're not sure if you wrote everything down, or you need to listen to that explanation again, or you think Mr. Johnson gave away a test question and you might not have written it down, you'll be able to go watch it. I've been pretty good at it. I've been doing it in my other class, and so far this semester I haven't missed recording a single lecture. I'm going to work really hard, but I'm imperfect, but I'm going to work really hard at letting you know what you need to be writing down. And if I say you need to write it down, that means I'm going to try to put a test question on there. Now, granted, I'm probably going to say write it down, or you're going to figure out you need to write it down way more than 50 times across the next 2.5 weeks for that test. But then I'm going to look at all those things that I thought people, and that's where I'm going to write my test questions. So if I say it twice, it's very likely to be on a test. If I going to be on a test, it's going to be on the test. I work really, really hard at that. If I tell you to write it down, you need to write it down. Now, for many of you, maybe you're really good at taking notes. That's awesome. You've been here for almost about 2/3. You've had some practice taking notes, so maybe all these things are a little bit redundant. If I said this is really important, that's something you need to write down. If it's on the screen, put it in bold print, italics print, or I've underlined, then you need to write it down. If you think it's important, then you need to write it down. If you're confused about something I'm talking about, then it's very possible that if you go home and study, you might not be able to figure it out. So the best time to let me know that you're confused is to raise your hand, or if I'm facing the board, hey, Mr. Johnson, could you explain that again, because I haven't a clue what you're talking about. That's a really good idea. And then, of course, I already said you could watch the lecture online if you want to. So the reading assignments, here we are. The reading assignments, go ahead, question. Yeah, you can take a picture, anything you want, I don't mind. If you send me an email, like what I end up doing is I'm probably going to be showing up at 7 o'clock every morning and then reviewing for 2 hours the lecture I'm going to give at 9. So if you sent me an email, I'd be really happy to, I could give you well, I don't know. I better ask Mr. Esmond if I can give you a copy of the PowerPoint lectures. I don't think he would mind. Okay. All right, then I'm not, because he generated these PowerPoints, so. Yeah, well, I'm trying to pretend I'm Mr. Esmond, except grayer. Although I did bang my knee up, so I'm walking kind of funny. In any case, the first lecture we're going to cover is turbine engine removal and replacement. So in case you're not looking at your syllabus, there's the reading assignment. It's in the PowerPoint Handbook 8083-32, and it's Chapter 8, pages 8-16 to 8-28. So that's 12 pages. But according to Mr. Esmond, you all have the reading assignment already, hiding somewhere in the depths of your backpack. Did anybody have the reading assignment tattooed to their butt? No, no one did. Okay, well, it is kind of hard to read it back there. All right, and just for fun, in case you have to find, if you want to find my YouTube channel, it helps if you know my middle initial. It's the letter C, as in Charlie. No, that's the middle initial. If you type in John Johnson, you get a lot of John Johnsons. But if you type in John C. Johnson, so here I am, John C. Johnson on YouTube. I'm doing a search. And there's my smiley, happy face before I used Grecian formula and got rid of all of my gray. And then you're going to look at my playlist. And one of these, I just added it this morning. Now, where is it? I just added, it says AMT 31, so I'll have to figure out why it's not there. But it's going to be AMT 31 hiding in here. All right. Well, that'll give me something to do next time I'm at my desk. Oh, the playlist one? Okay, well, maybe that's it. I haven't put a video on there yet. So there it is. You don't have to put the dot, but if you type in John C. Johnson, you see my pretty, pretty face. All right, so here's what I recommend you do if you want to study well in order to be able to pass the test. How many people in here would like to get higher than a 70% on these two tests? Almost half the class. I'm just kidding. Most of you raised your hand. Oh, great. So the number one thing you can start off with is to take a lot of notes. Take really good notes in class. Watch the online lecture as needed. Review FAA test questions that pertain to this topic, remembering that questions are going to change and the number of answers is going to be increased. And you notice I wrote there on the underline, you need to understand why it's the right answer. If you're just memorizing answers, you probably won't get the question right. Mr. Esmond told me he likes to take those FAA questions and turn them around and make them the opposite. Has anybody ever noticed that? Okay, all right, so that won't be strange for you. I recommend you study by yourself. I recommend you study in a group. I recommend that if you don't understand anything, you can ask me. If you're looking at FA test questions, if you bring one in and say, Mr. Johnson, I read this, I see what the answer is, I don't know why it's the right answer, I'd be really happy to discuss the why so you can get a better understanding of what's going on. Question? Is that a statement or a question?
Yeah, because I didn't know that there was.
This lecture that I'm giving right now, I am recording it and I'm going to put it on YouTube. Sometime, if I have a chance, I'll do it at break, and if I don't, I'll do it this evening. But usually I'll have it up by 4 or 5 p.m. every night. And then that's all right. And then I also recommend you start studying for the test more than just the night before the test. Does that work for most people? You just cram your butt off the night before? Oh, well, whatever works for you. All right. So, I'm guessing, do you prefer if the front lights are off? All right. When I was in the Air Force, I was in training at this one location, and we called it the blue bedroom. They had blue trim, and there was a stage, and somebody was doing PowerPoint, and there was usually 300 to 500 people in this lecture hall, and they always turned down the lights. It was the old school when they barely had, where they had just invented computer projectors, and they were really weak. So they would turn the really lights down, and then all of the students would fall asleep. And then we'd get demerits for falling asleep. But we called it the blue bedroom. Oh, this was when I was in officer candidate school, learning how to be an officer. All right. So just in case you didn't catch it, power plant removal and installation. I like to call it R&R. So does anybody in here know what R&R stands for? No, it's not rest and relaxation. If you write that on the test, you get it wrong. Remove and replace. So you're going to write that down because I like that term. If you see that in a maintenance logbook, and it's usually capital R and then an and symbol and a capital R, that means it got removed and a different one got put in its place. Now that different one might have been new, it might have been overhauled, it might have been repaired, but R&R doesn't mean you took off the old one, fixed it, and put the old one back on. R&R means you took off the old one and put a different one back in its place. So, how many people in here, this is your 4th semester here? Don't worry, I'm going to try to pick on everyone equally, unless I don't like you. So there's like at least 2 people? Okay, all right. How many people this is your 3rd semester? How many people this is your 2nd semester? How many people is your 1st semester? Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So, let's see. Let's see about just this is your 1st semester. Every 2nd, 3rd, and 4th don't answer this. So if this is your 1st semester, see if you can answer it. So we're going to cover generic instructions on how to take out some turbine engines. Okay. Do you believe that the instructions in this FAA handbook, the Power Plant Mechanics Handbook, is that the document that we need to follow when we're doing it on a real engine? Is this your 1st semester? Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, well, both of you gentlemen. The guy behind you was shaking his head up and down. So you were shaking your head left and right. Okay. You were shaking your head left and right. Okay. What's wrong with using the 8083 Power Plant Handbook for your instructions on how to remove and replace engines? Yeah, it doesn't have the proper or correct removal instructions. Would it be somebody else besides you, also in this is your 1st semester, would it be legal to use that handbook? You're not in the 1st semester. It would be legal to use the handbook as the instructions. Well, it's a good thing you're in the 1st semester because then I can forgive you for not going like this. No, that handbook isn't legal to do anything. I'm going to say that again. That handbook that the reading assignment is, the Power Plant Handbook 8083-32, it's not a legal document that tells you how to do anything. Anybody in the 1st semester, where would you look to find the real live legal instructions on how to take a jet engine out of an airplane? Say that again? The maintenance manual for that particular aircraft and or you might have to look at the maintenance manual for the engine. But who built the airplane? The engine manufacturer or the airplane manufacturer? The airplane manufacturer. So likely it's the airplane manufacturer is probably going to have the instructions on where to do it. So number one here, this is what you need to get out of this slide, is whenever you're doing maintenance, including doing engine removal and replacement, make sure you follow the manufacturer's maintenance manual. You have to follow the legal maintenance manual. So we're going to cover some generic procedures. Here's some things you usually do, but it doesn't apply to every single instance. All right. So has anybody ever heard of an APU? I guess if you've been doing labs in Mr. Jason's or Mr. Esmond's jet engine lab, everybody knows what an APU is because that's what those T62s, those solars are. They're APUs. Anybody, I guess. What do you do with an APU? What's it used for? Yes, so that's number one. So on somewhere you're going to write this down. What is an APU for? Well, number one, an APU stands for Auxiliary Power Unit. I love asking people in tests, what do these three letters mean, APU, and you would be able to write Auxiliary Power Unit. I know auxiliary is tough because it's got, an X in it, and you're trying to figure out where the I's are. I always thought auxiliary had two L's, but I guess I was wrong. So APU stands for Auxiliary Power Unit. One use, if we made a list of what can you use an APU for, number one is it provides the power to start the main. It provides power to start the main engines. Now, if we're talking about a transport category jet, an airliner, or we're talking about a big business jet, those big giant engines, the ones that are this big in diameter, what kind of power do they use to start the engines? Pneumatic power. So that APU has to provide what kind of power then? Pneumatic power in the form of high pressure air and a whole lot of it, a high volume air. So there's a lot of APUs out there. In fact, I would say most of the APUs out there, their number one priority is to be able to provide high pressure air at a very high volume, a whole bunch of air, in order to start the main engines. Can anybody tell me, other than Elizabeth, what's the secondary purpose, usually, of an APU? I can say that. Provide electricity. Yeah, that's very good. So a second use of an APU is to provide electrical power for the whole airplane. I mean, let's face it. Let's talk about a big $30 million business jet. The CEO of the company gets on the airplane and wants a margarita. But the main engines haven't started yet. Do you want to be telling the CEO they can't have a margarita because there's no electrical power to run the blender? Of course not. So what you're going to do as the pilot or a maintenance personnel assigned to the aircraft, you're going to have the APU fired up, and you're going to have the electrical generator on that APU providing electrical power across the aircraft so you can run the blender, even though the main engines aren't running. So I'm making that an example because I know airplane mechanics like margaritas in general. Isn't that true? If you don't like margaritas, stand up. Really? You don't like margaritas? You never had a margarita? Well, it may be illegal for some people in this state to drink alcoholic beverages. So I'm not implying that you should drink as an aircraft mechanic or implying that you should drink under age. All right, so you need very common. Can anybody think of a third? So the second important thing for APUs to provide is electrical power to the aircraft, generally when it's on the ground, so you can run stuff on the airplane. Does anybody know what a third use of the APU is? It is true that if you had in-flight failures, you could use the APU. So let's go ahead and write that down as one of the uses of an APU. In-flight, it can provide both electrical and pneumatic power in an emergency. So in an emergency, in flight, you can fire up the APU. Like if all your generators on all your engines quit. I mean, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible. or if for some reason some valve failed on the engines and you couldn't maintain pressurization, you could actually use the APU to help pressurize the airplane, although that you're probably just going to descend if you're a pilot. What is an APU for on the ground? We got electrical power, we got pneumatic power to start the engines. What's that? You're on the ground, it's normal operation. The APU's providing pneumatic power and it's providing electrical power. How many people, I'm guessing if this is your first semester, have you had air conditioning systems yet? That was last semester. Okay, so don't feel bad if you're in your first semester and you can't think of the answer. But if you were here last semester, now you can feel bad. So I just gave it away. So what else might you want to run on the ground? The AC, the air conditioning. So this is now how many? Is this the fourth thing? Okay, so the fourth thing you can do with an APU is use the pneumatic power to run the air conditioner on the ground. Because that CEO coming to that business jet, they want to drink their margarita and it's on the ramp on a hot day in Phoenix, and the black asphalt ramp is probably 120 degrees, and the inside of the airplane it would be a lot hotter than that. So it's very common to fire up the APU and then use it to power the air conditioning systems. I'm not going to go into the air conditioning systems. The majority of air conditioning systems on jets runs off pneumatic power. Now, usually it runs off of the main engines and takes bleed air off of the engines. But if the main engines aren't running, the APU can do it. So we got four things that you can use an APU for. Does anybody have any questions about those four things? All right, so we know what an APU is, we know what you can do with it, and so if we were going to take it out of the aircraft, I'm going to go forward to a picture. This is the tail end, and I'm pretty sure it's of a 7, I was thinking it was a 727, but it's not a 727 because there's an engine there. 727 has the APU up under the wing. But if you look at most business jets, and if you look at most airliners, they put the APU as far back in the tail as humanly possible. In fact, if you look at most business jets, and in particular the airliners, and you look at the tail, it looks like there's a tube. It doesn't stick out, but the tail isn't curved. It looks like like it's sawed off, and yeah, it's because there is a 10 or 12 or 18-inch diameter exhaust pipe for the APU. These pictures don't show it, but the APU exhaust actually comes out the tail, whether it's a 747 or an Airbus A320. This is the usual place where APUs are put. The nice thing about them, you don't have to write, they're way in the back, so they make the least amount of noise for the passengers. Anybody ever get on a jet airliner? Anybody ever get on a jet airliner in Phoenix in the summer? Yeah, okay. You walk in and it's making noise because the APU is running, but they're keeping the air conditioning on so people don't sweat like a horse. Because if you sweat like a horse, you're gonna probably buy a ticket from somewhere else because you don't really want to be a horse. Does anybody want to be a horse? You don't have to answer that question out loud. It's okay. There are some things that's better if you keep secret. Okay. So if you're going to take the APU out, you're going to need to open the doors, and you're going to need to latch the doors so they don't flop around in the wind. One of the problems with working on aircraft inside of hangars is that you end up forgetting that you might have to take precautions because of the wind. So let's write this part down here. When you open the doors, you need to either take them off or latch them down so the wind won't blow them around. You got to understand, if you're doing maintenance on a jet airplane, it might not fit in the hangar, or the hangar might be full, and you might have to do this outside. And the wind's going to blow, and you go, oh, well, the wind's not blowing right now. Well, what about in an hour, or 2 hours, or 5 hours, or on the next shift? You may be the one taking the APU out of the airplane. Somebody else may be putting it up. Those doors might be open. So you can see in this picture here, there's a latching mechanism right there. And then there's another one right here, and that's going to hold the door so it doesn't flop around. All right, I don't even know what a lower support shroud is. Okay, the number 3 here is we're going to disconnect stuff. disconnect stuff. So let's make another list. Let's make a list of the things that we could disconnect. So what are the things that we would disconnect? Let's do that. We're going to go straight across the back person in each row, starting with Evan. So Evan, can you think of something? You're taking an engine out of an aircraft. What do you think is one thing you'd have to disconnect? And you know, if you say the magneto P lead for the ignition, I'll probably laugh at you, but that's okay. Fuel line. Okay. And I'm going to put an S in there because there might be more than one. So I'm sorry, sir, I don't know your name. What's your name? James? Hi, James. How you doing? Is it Friday yet? Yeah, that was a trick question. No, it's not Friday. Sorry. So, James, you look like an experienced aircraft mechanic. This is your 4th semester, right? You're going to graduate here? Oh, okay. You're a freshman aircraft mechanic student. So, have you worked on a lot of jet engines before? Just one's here. Okay. All right. Can you think of anything that if you were going to take the engine out of the aircraft, I know you haven't been doing that, these engines that you've been working on in the lab are already out of the aircraft. Can you think of anything that you might have to disconnect before you drop the engine out? No. Okay. Does anybody want to help him out? What's that? Electrical. There's going to be tons of electrical wiring. And we're just going to call them cables. And again, I'm going to put the S on here. Because I'll bet you $10 most of these engines, it's not just going to be one electrical cable. There's probably going to be 2 or 3 or 4 electrical cables. I should know your name, but I don't. Hey, Brian. How you doing today? James says it's not Friday. Do you agree with that? Yes. Okay. Brian, can you think of anything on a jet engine that you would need to disconnect before you took it out of the aircraft? Pneumatic lines. Very good. Let's see if I can spell pneumatic. P-U. There we go. That's how the P is silent. But if I say P-U, has anybody ever seen Pepe Le Pew? You know, the skunk cartoon guy? P-U. So that's how I remember E becomes before U. Because I have a hard time figuring out if the E comes before U. It's also in alphabetical order. So, pneumatic ducts. You know what I think? And I think we're going to put here for most of the time, engines, including APUs, have generators on them to generate electrical power for the rest of the airplane. So that's going to be one set of cables, is electrical power. So these are going to be big ones. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the gentleman who's texting in class in the back of the 3rd row. You're taking notes. Okay, party on. So can you think of another something to disconnect before we take the engine out of the airplane? Whatever's attached to the air intake. So you know what? I think we might have to remove the intake. Is that what you're talking about? It really, really depends on the engine. If it's the APU stuck inside of the airframe, inside of the tail, you're going to have to disconnect the engine from the intake, and the intake is going to sit in the airplane. If it's the engine out on the wing, the intake may stay on the engine, and you take the engine off with the intake intact. So, behind Rewind, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Luis? How you doing, Luis? It's not. I have two people that tell me it's not Friday. Do you agree with that? You do? Okay, Luis, can you think of something else that we would disconnect from an engine? Say that again? You've done this a lot, right? You're just here to bone up before you take your oral practical? What's the opposite of an intake, Luis? What's on the other end of the engine? The exhaust. Again, if it's the engine, if it's just the main engine on a wing, the exhaust is probably going to stay with the engine. But if it's an APU inside of the airframe, we're going to have the exhaust. We're probably going to have to disconnect the APU from the exhaust duct. In fact, I'll even, yeah. Let's see. Who's the next person to harass? I think I knew your name at some point in my life. Hey, Eric, how you doing? I think that would vary a lot. I think, here's the question. Could you take the engine out without taking the starter off? What kind of harness? Well, when you say main harness, I'm thinking about riding a horse. The starter harness. Well, so you mean the electrical connections to the... Okay, I'll accept that. So we disconnected electrical cables from the generator. So let's do the starter cables. There might just be one. Okay. Depends on the APU. I guess you have to have a control circuit there, huh? Yeah, you're not in the back. You're not the last person in the row. Okay, I accept the fact that starter motors may have more than one cable. I used to know your name. Hey, Kyle, how you doing? It's not Friday. Is that correct? Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to have to meditate. Can you give me about 5 seconds? I'm going to pretend it's Friday. Sweet. Yeah, there's some good jokes there. So, Kyle, you got a thought? Engine, wow, that is awesome. So, engine instruments. And these could be lines or they could be cables. Man, we're getting a long list. I said your name once, like 2 months ago. No, this gentleman right here in the front. Valentino? Alentino, with an A? Okay, sorry. I used to work at this place called Valentino's Pizzeria. So, not that you look like Joe Valentino. He was about 50 when I met him, and you don't look a day over. Well, I'm not authorized to guess student names. Alentino, have you done a lot of engine remove and replacements? Not really. Okay, I'll open it up then. What else might we have to disconnect? Heat shielding. We might have to take it apart. Is shielding I before E except after E? I read somewhere that the I before E except after E only works about 48% of the time, so it's actually not a good rule. Okay, we'll see if we can come back to this. So let's see. All right. So we've been disconnecting things, but I think this one is pretty important. And we're going to add to that. You're going to need to open the circuit breakers, and you're probably going to need to label the controls inside the cockpit. If you ever heard those fun stories about people doing things inside the cockpit and they forgot that there's somebody out working on the airplane somewhere. When I went to airplane mechanic school in the U.S. Air Force it was right after the war. It was in 1946, and they had this. Thanks for grinning, Kyle. I appreciate that. I look this young because I use Grecian formula. It keeps the grade. That and I go. Santa Claus, and I know he's old. You've been Santa Claus before? Oh, sorry. I misunderstood what you said. When I was in airplane mechanic school in the Air Force, they showed us a training film. It was a reenactment, but they were talking about somebody. They had the hydraulic system running on a B-52 bomber, and the bottom of the airplane has these hydraulically operated doors, and they come together and they close. There's no gap in there. And the story was that somebody was standing on the ground in the bomb bay, and somebody in the cockpit opened the closed the bomb bay doors, and it chopped them in half. So it's a really good idea, especially when you're working on a large aircraft, is to pull circuit breakers so people can't do things. And when I say pull them, you put zip ties around them, and then you write a label on it, say, work in progress. So that when somebody gets into the cockpit and they say, I need to start up the APU, they don't start trying to start it. And they can't because the circuit breaker has a plastic zip tie around it and it's labeled. What's the problem? Has anybody ever worked on a big giant airplane? Okay. So is it common to be working on the airplane yet there's electrical power on it somewhere else? Yeah, because otherwise if you have to turn off the electrical power, then the other 4 aircraft mechanics can't do their job. They need electrical power. So it's very possible you're going to have to work on the aircraft when there's electrical power on. So here's some important things to write down. Number 1, whenever possible, work on the aircraft with the electrical power off. If it's possible, work on the aircraft with the electrical power off. But number 2, if electrical power has to be on, then you need to pull the circuit breakers, put a zip tie around it, and label it. Yes, so number 2, if power has to be on, you need to pull the circuit breakers, they're also called tie wraps. Put a zip tie around it, and put a label on it. And you don't have to write down what the label is, but you need to write down the label like, work in progress, or working on APU. Yeah, that's right. Put mine in. Because, I think, has anybody ever been electrocuted? All right. Was it fatal for anybody? Okay, all right. Were you brought back to life, or was that just in an earlier life and you've been reincarnated? You had a nice funeral? Do you recall that funeral? Okay. So we're going to open the circuit breakers and zip tie and label. So that's number 2, and number 1 was electrical power off if possible. So this is a really good habit pattern no matter what. What if you're out there, the electrical power is off and you're doing your work, you didn't pull the circuit breakers and you didn't label it, somebody else comes out to work on that 747 and they decide to turn the electrical power on. Are you going to wish that you had pulled the circuit breakers and zip-tied them and labeled them? Yes. So you need to do that no matter what. All right, so just for fun, let's see how many of these things we got here. Let's see. APU harness, that's a good question. I think, although we're talking about multiple electrical connections, so we don't have to write that down. We talked about the starter motor. We talked about the generator. Sweet. All right. We have a pretty good list. What was that other list that we had? Did we not have another list? We had another list. Didn't we have a list about APUs? PU. Pneumatic power for main engine start. Let's see if I can remember. I didn't take notes while I was telling y'all what to write down. Is electrical power for the aircraft. And then we had two more. We had in-flight pneumatic and or electrical power. And then we had, don't tell me, oh yeah, power the air conditioning on the ground. There are some military aircraft that have an APU that run hydraulic pumps, like a CH-46 or CH-47 Chinook, probably. But I've even seen an APU on an F-16, and then they use the hydraulic power to start the main engines. But I've never seen a civilian aircraft have a hydraulic pump on an APU. So I'll tell the other gentleman that we're going to start at 32 after. So that's all I have for today, because we went 2 minutes over. He goes till 10. He gives a longer lecture. All right. Class is dismissed. I'll talk to Mr. Esmond.